Preston Stewart is a U.S. Army veteran and a YouTuber who makes videos on war, politics, national security and foreign affairs. Welcome to the program, Stewart.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I would like to start with the latest developments on the ground in Ukraine. Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Army, General Syrskyi, says that Ukraine now controls 100 Russia's settlements and 500 square miles of the Russian soil. At the same time, Ukrainian troops continues its advances deep inside Russia in the Kursk region. What is your take on this achievement, and what was the most fascinating thing for you in this offensive inside Russia?
Nobody saw it coming. It was hard to imagine this even a few months ago, let alone if we go back to the winter of 2022, when so many people were worried, could Ukraine hold on for weeks or maybe even months? And here we are, almost 2 years or more than 2 years later, and they're taking hundreds of settlements inside of Russia. So it was incredibly unexpected in a lot of ways. It's interesting to see. Again, this was a major offensive operation. It wasn't the cross-border raids that we've seen before. Clearly, as we're learning more and more as this information comes out, this was a very concerted effort, and Syrskyi and the Ukrainian Armed Forces did a pretty incredible job of keeping this under wraps and not letting leaks to the United States or really any foreign media, even internal media to Ukraine, get a hold of this and kind of spoil the plan. So it's been interesting to see, and it sounds like there might be more in the works, just kind of reading between the lines of some of Syrskyi's most recent statements.
In one of your videos on YouTube, you said that this operation could be a diversion and another attack could happen on other areas of the front line. Could you please share with us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a prediction in war, so take that with a grain of salt. And obviously, this operation shows that Syrskyi, Zelensky, and the Ukrainian High Command knows a lot of things that we don't know here on the outside looking in. So take this with a big grain of salt. But some of the reasons and the rationale given for this Kursk operation was to create a type of buffer zone. Another one was to pull Russian forces from other areas of the front, specifically in the Donbass. And we haven't really seen that. And it's hard to imagine that Ukraine would dedicate this many pieces of equipment, this many units, this many soldiers to moving inside of Russia for the possibility that Russia might relocate troops from elsewhere, which would really just be a temporary reprieve along the front, or the idea that it would humiliate Putin to the point of kind of driving him to the negotiating table. There's been a lot of things that have humiliated Putin in the last couple of years, and nothing's really made that happen. So it does seem like this was part of something larger. I know there's been a lot of speculation in Russian media in recent weeks of another offensive push happening maybe somewhere in the south, Kherson, Zaporozhye, maybe even Crimea. But that's kind of reading between the lines. Again, it's a prediction in war, and war is incredibly unpredictable.
Also, many Western commentators did not expect this attack, and they were sharing this narrative about unwinnable war in Ukraine. Do you feel that they understood that they were wrong about this narrative, this idea? What is the reaction from these people right now? You have been analyzing this issue. What do you see from these people right now?
The term stalemate has fallen off a little bit. That was becoming more and more common in recent months, really since last summer's counteroffensive in the south. We saw Ukraine put a significant effort into trying to push the Russians back, and those lines were no joke. It's the most advanced fortifications that Europe has seen since World War II. Following that, I think a lot of folks that I would consider supportive of Ukraine and would like to see Ukraine succeed in this war kind of came to the realization, if you will, that it might not be realistic to see this resolved on the battlefield. And I think the last few months have kind of they've shown that to play out, where Ukraine has made modest gains in certain areas and Russia has kind of continued to grind along, especially in the east. this changes things. All of a sudden, we're seeing maneuver warfare, and we're seeing Ukraine able to push into Russian territory, which again was unthinkable not that long ago. So I think it's changed the conversation a little bit. Maybe lets people recognize that there's more to be done here, and there's more ways to win a war than to continue to press forces up against the same hardened lines that Ukraine attacked, a little over a year ago.
Don't you think that this operation could be a kind of a message to the West? Like, we can beat Russia, we can beat Russian troops on the ground, just continue to support Ukraine and give us all what is needed for the victory, and allow us to strike even more deep inside Russia with the US-made long-range precision weapons.
I think it is a message in a lot of ways to their Western supporters, to NATO and the United States and others. But I think a big part of that message is showing that Ukraine can carry out an operation like this on their own. Of course, a lot of this equipment and training and previous intelligence did come through partnership with the United States and NATO. But again, by all accounts, Ukraine did not inform the United States, Great Britain, Germany, anybody about this taking place, and they were able to carry out this operation successfully. So I think there's a little bit here of maybe Ukraine showing that they're getting frustrated, which is understandable, that previous operations run through their Western partners at times have leaked. At other times, they've been told, stand down, you can't do that, or you're not going to have our support. And I can see how that would be frustrating for Ukraine. And to me, this kind of reads as them saying, hey, we're just going to do what we need to do to win this war, and we would appreciate your support. Again, kind of trying to read between the lines there.
From your perspective, why didn't the U.S. warn Ukraine against this operation after the beginning of this push? I mean, this a good news that they did not warn Ukraine against this operation. Why didn't they warn against it? Maybe because they saw a kind of operational success there?
I think the concern with the United States has always been a fear of escalation, which is a rational fear when we're talking about a nuclear armed state like Russia that constantly threatens to use nuclear weapons for any and all reasons. So there's a very rational fear there, but I think it all is kind of settled in that. The idea that we don't want to be seen advocating or supporting an invasion of a sovereign country, even if it's in the middle of a war. And I think it's a complicated messaging there that doesn't always, and I think we're seeing that it doesn't always play out. In the middle of a war, sometimes you need to take the fight to the adversary, and you can't be on the defense 24/7, 365. But I think it's the United States trying to walk the line in that messaging of we can't overtly give approval for Ukraine to go on the offensive inside of Russia, but at the same time, it looks like it worked out. And as of now, Russia hasn't done anything outside of Ukraine in an escalatory manner. Of course, we had an awful strike in the last couple days in Ukraine, but that red line that everybody's so concerned about still appears to be in place, or not breached, I should say.
Yeah, it's true. Russia has been bombing Ukraine for a while, and in recent days, like yesterday and today in the early morning, we faced numerous missile and drone attacks from the Russian side. However, our Air Force and our armed forces have intercepted most of the missiles and drones. I can see even like most of those naval threats, those threats from the air. And do you think that they are losing this battle in the air because they did not succeed in targeting most of targets they would like to?
That's a tough one. Ukraine is at a big disadvantage in that air war. Russia just has so many of these missiles and drones to fire. And for the most part, they're so much cheaper than the interceptors that Ukraine has. I know that Ukraine has thrown some impressive innovation out there to find new and unique ways to bring down these munitions. I think this week we saw a video of a helicopter having a door gunner shoot down one of the Shahed drones, which of course is a lot cheaper than a lot of air defense missiles. But as it sits today, that's a very tough battle for Ukraine to win outright, even with the support of their Western partners. And I think that kind of goes back into the permission for Ukraine to strike targets inside of Russia. Russia is able to launch these munitions from well outside of Ukraine to where Ukraine is on the defensive. And it doesn't matter how capable or how robust an air defense network is, they're not perfect. Something's going to get through, and it only takes a few hits to cause significant damage. And especially now we're talking about more than 2 years of bombarding Ukrainian infrastructure. It doesn't take a lot to cause a lot of problems. So long as Ukraine is simply on the receiving end and having to shoot down these munitions in their own airspace, personally, I think that's an unwinnable aspect of this war. Where that table turns is if Ukraine is either authorized by their Western partners, or as we've seen in recent days, they've developed their own munitions capable of striking deep inside of Russia, and they take that fight to some of these launch platforms inside of Russia, some of the air bases that these attacks are emanating from.
You mentioned about new long-range capabilities of Ukraine. President Zelensky announced that Ukraine has successfully developed new ballistic missile and another long-range cruise missile drone. Don't you think that Ukraine has come to realize that it is on its own in a matter of long-range capabilities?
For now, unfortunately, I think that is the case. It's not surprising at all that Ukraine found a way to manufacture these long-range capabilities. At baseline, they were heading in that direction in the first place, but then they have this abundance of Western supplied equipment that they have the ability to study a little bit to find out how they can manufacture something themselves. From a Ukrainian perspective, I think it was probably the right move. Recognizing again that there are airfields and launch locations inside of Russia that they can now possibly strike and change the direction of this war. We'll see. It'll be interesting to see if their ability to do that, creating that homegrown solution, kind of forces the hand of the United States, NATO, and others to permit Ukraine to use things like ATACMS, Storm Shadow, to conduct some of those strikes additionally. But it's a big change in this war.
Also, Politico reported that Ukraine is preparing a list of targets for the Biden administration, which it wants to strike deep inside Russia. This week there would be a round of negotiations between President Zelensky administration and Biden administration. Some people suggest that President Biden could be open to a final move to support Ukraine, to this final big decision in the support for Ukraine, to support Ukraine, also because it's like last month in the office. From your perspective, do you expect this final big decision of President Biden for Ukraine before he ends his political career and before he ends his presidency?
That's a tough one. There's a lot at play. My gut tells me that this list of targets that Ukraine is presenting is not new. I would have expected Ukraine to have these targets lined up probably 2 years ago, if not earlier, and they've been sitting on a desk or it's a regular talking point. Anytime the conversation comes up about long-range strikes inside of Russia, I'm certain that there is a standard list. Hey, we sure would like to hit, for instance, Engels 2 Air Base. So I'm sure that that list isn't necessarily new. It makes sense that they're pushing it right now, given the recent development of their domestic long-range munition. In terms of Biden making a decision in the last few months, I think it's really hard to tell. I would expect more at this point in terms of the arming of Ukraine. Maybe they'll sign on for a new aid shipment in terms of military equipment to Ukraine. But the decision to strike targets inside of Russia is one that would last into the next administration, whether that's Vice President Harris or former President Trump. I don't know. It's hard to imagine a big decision like that being made simply because there's only a few months left in office. I would hope that a decision like that is made based off of the impact it could have on the battlefield. But you raise a very valid point. There's going to be a new administration in some way, shape, or form in a few months here, and it's entirely possible some major decisions are made in that window.
Also, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said that he would propose a plan to the United States how he intends to end the war in Ukraine. He said that the Kursk operation is a part of this plan, peace plan for Ukraine. Don't you think that we are missing a bigger picture here, and we are missing some important details about how this Kursk operation could play its role in ending the war in Ukraine, and how could it be a part of the big Ukraine's plan for a victory, for a peace in Ukraine?
Of course, that's hard to see at this point. Again, I think it suggests that Zelensky, Syrskyi, and the Ukrainian leadership have a lot more going on right now than we in the public understand. This, it's a major chunk of Kursk that Ukraine has taken, especially when you look at other portions of the front throughout this war. But it's also just a relatively small piece of territory in Western Russia. It's not Moscow. And I would argue that that portion of Russia may not be as important to Putin as now portions of eastern Ukraine and certainly Crimea. So it's hard to imagine that what we've seen already, where Russia is still massing forces to try to push Ukraine out of Kursk. It's by no means guaranteed that Ukraine is going to be able to hold on to that indefinitely. So it's hard to see that incursion, as impactful as it's been, is going to be the thing that drives the end of this war. Again, kind of takes it back to the prediction, if you will, that there's more at play here. Another, a second phase of this operation, or maybe, again, just more that Zelensky, Syrskyi, and the others know that hasn't yet made it public.
Also, there have been some reports about other things that could bring the war in Ukraine closer to its end. The Guardian reported that Ukrainian military commanders developed a new military strategy. They would try to target Moscow and St. Petersburg with long-range missiles and strikes. They would ask the United States to allow that to do it, but it seems like in the nearest future Ukraine would have this ability to do these long-range strikes on Moscow and St. Petersburg on its own. What is your take on this strategy to put more pressure on Moscow and St. Petersburg?
It would be interesting. We've seen a little bit. It's worth noting Ukraine has carried out drone strikes inside of Moscow for a while now, and they haven't appeared to have a major effect. And again, it might be one of those things that is embarrassing to Putin. Of course, enemy drones flying over your capital city is concerning to any country, especially as they continue to talk about winning this war and how Ukraine is on their last leg. And next thing you know, something's going boom in Moscow. Maybe over a longer period of time, that has the possibility to wear down kind of Moscow's support of the war, which is arguably more important than the general Russian population in other parts of the country. It's hard to tell. That would have to be a long-term campaign. It's hard to imagine Ukraine putting together a campaign of the sorts that would really devastate the city of Moscow. And I'm not sure that would do anything but maybe drive the Russian population to want to fight back even more. I mean, there's arguments that the Kursk operation has led to an increase in Russian recruitment. That's just a rumor right now, but you can see how that could happen. So I'm not sure. It definitely would have a psychological impact. It would be a psychologically positive win for Ukraine to be able to see that Russians are on the receiving end of these awful missile and drone strikes that Ukraine has lived under now for 2+ years. I'm not sure in the short term that it would have what's necessary to really end the war per se. But of course, we'll see. If it's a long 6, 9, 12-month campaign, it's an entirely different story.
But don't you think that there is a matter of the amount, the size of warhead in these missiles? Don't you think that all depends on the warheads which are going to explode near Moscow and St. Petersburg? It
could. Something that I didn't expect was the Russian resilience in this war. I thought a long time ago we'd see more of the citizenry turning against this war, especially as casualties continue to mount, as sanctions took hold, and we saw Russia become more and more isolated on the international community. I thought a long time ago we would see more of an anti-war sentiment rise up inside of Russia, and any sort of drone or missile strikes well beyond the front that's not directly targeting a military resource is going to be that's the kind of direction you're hoping, is that the citizens kind of stand up, or the government even, and says, hey, we don't want to do this anymore. I feel like we haven't seen that from Russia, any cracks in that armor from Russia at all at this point. So to your point, maybe, depending on the size of the impact, the size of the warhead and what is hit, it certainly could change things. But again, it seems like trying to get the Russian people to want to end this war hasn't worked quite yet. And it's hard to tell what it would take to get them to that point. Also, I would like to get back to the Kursk operation. You have been analyzing and observing this offensive inside Russia. From your perspective, what are the biggest failures of the Russian army regarding this issue? I mean, intelligence failures and other matters. What
did impress you the most? I mean, in the matter of Russian failures?
There were a couple of big things there. First was, of course, the intelligence piece we talked about a little bit previously, where Ukraine maintained operational security and didn't get out at all. There were stories about how soldiers taking part in the operation didn't exactly know what they were doing until 24 or 48 hours prior. So maintaining that level of operational security from Ukraine's perspective was very impressive. Russia, there's also been stories that they had an idea that this was happening, and at some point along the chain of command decided that it wasn't going to happen or wasn't significant. Either way, major Russian failure for anything like this to happen in modern war with how many drones are over the battlefield. That's just a big ball dropped by Russia. One of the major takeaways for me is kind of the nature of maneuver warfare that Ukraine pushed forward into Russia. We saw during the summer offensive last year, one of the major challenges was Ukraine would push some of their maneuver assets, armored personnel carriers, Bradleys, APCs, tanks even, out front and try to breach obstacles and move on the Russian positions. And those vehicles quickly became susceptible to, most notably, drones, but also ATGMs and airstrikes and artillery. So what we saw Ukraine carry out this time was just straight lessons learned from the southern offensive. They pushed air defense assets in quickly. They hit a lot of Russian assets with FPV drones kind of leading the assault, to where when tanks and armored vehicles started rolling in, that airborne threat wasn't there in any way comparable to what we see elsewhere along the front. So it's interesting to see Ukraine adapt to those tactics in an offensive manner, which they've not had a lot of practice in large-scale offensive operations at this point. And Russia, it appears, didn't adapt at all. We still saw days before Russia was able to consolidate and try to push Ukraine out of certain areas. And for quite a while there, it was absolute chaos with the Russian chain of command trying to figure out where is Ukraine, who's going to try to stop that pocket, how can we get to this position? I mean, we saw the television reporter going on air showing a Russian convoy traveling along a certain bridge, and then shortly thereafter, we saw some of these major convoys being destroyed by HIMARS. That's not something that happens in other portions of the front, or not for a while, because Russia learned those lessons there. And it seemed like they weren't able to take those same lessons learned and move them over to Kursk in the way that it appears at this point Ukraine was.
Let's cover also Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it seems like many things went wrong for him. I mean, Yevgeny Prigozhin's mutiny and his push to Moscow, and then Ukraine's offensive inside Russia. Do you think Vladimir Putin, did he regret invading Ukraine?
Hard to tell. Hard to get inside someone's mind like that. I would say there's no way he expected it to look like this 2 years in. There's a lot of debate as to how quickly Russia thought that they were going to take Kyiv, and how quickly they'd be able to install a puppet government of sorts. Whether that was 3 days or 3 weeks or 3 months, there's no way that it was 2 years and tens of thousands of soldiers. So I think it's hard for Putin to look at this point as any form of success. Of course, he's still very much in the fight, and there's no indications that he's planning on stopping anytime soon. But I think it's fair to say that this has been incredibly more costly than anything Putin would have anticipated.
Don't you think that his regime become more fragile after this invasion of Ukraine, rather than it was before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
I would expect. I'm no expert in Russian internal politics, but in any war, when you see this number of casualties, this amount of political tension and turmoil, it has to cause cracks within any ruling regime, in an autocracy or in a democracy. It just has the possibility of causing problems there. So have to expect that they're a little more fragile today than they were, 2.5 years ago. But again, not an expert on Russian domestic politics.
And next question for you would be also regarding Vladimir Putin. From your perspective, does he know what is really going on the ground? What is your suggestion on that?
I don't think he does. And we've seen a couple different accounts at this point, and it's not just a Russian thing. We tend to see this in a handful of governments, especially the more authoritarian type, where the exact reports of what's happening kind of get filtered out as they move up the chain. And we've had countless reports at this point from kind of mid-level Russian leadership and some reporters, some Russian mill bloggers arguing about this, saying the reports from the front lines, by the time they get 2 or 3 levels up, are just whitewashed. And they're talking about nothing but positive results and minimal casualties and everything is okay. But then when you get down into the front and interact with the soldiers and the platoon commanders at that level, there's major issues. Even if it's not anything necessarily going wrong, it does seem like the casualties are being underreported. The Russian progress is being overreported. It's hard to imagine at this point. A lot of the people we've seen come and go from Putin's circle, it looks like he wants people around him that are kind of doing his bidding, but also giving him positive news. And, we saw Surovikin get removed after the Wagner mutiny. And one of the major pushbacks against Surovikin was he forced the withdrawal from Kherson. And it was bad news for Russia, really, right? And he went on the defensive and started digging in, which, arguably had a major impact on the southern offensive last summer. But he was relatively quickly removed. And we see a lot of the people in Putin's leadership circle that have been there for quite a while wanting to provide, you have to imagine, to keep their jobs, provide positive feedback. So no, at this point, it's hard to imagine that Putin has a very clear picture of exactly what's playing out at the front.
Do you mean that there are only people around him who would tell him only like a good lie, good news, but it could be a lie? Do you think that he liked to hear only good news from his people, and he would fire all military commanders who could tell truth, but it could be a bad truth for him?
I would say watered down is probably the way I would put it. There's no way they'd be able to continue functioning in this war if the information was just outright false from the front. There wouldn't have been need for a mobilization. There wouldn't have been need to increase the bonus and the pay to pull in more Russian soldiers. You can't do that and at the same time tell Putin that everything is fine and there's no casualties being suffered. My guess is that it's a watered down version, and anything that is a Ukrainian success is kind of tamped down as it's not important. It doesn't really matter. And anything that is a Russian success is kind of elevated as being much more important. That'd be my guess. And then anybody operating in that system, it's not just a matter of they tell the truth, they stay, they lie, they get removed, but you learn how to operate in that type of organization. And it's not all that different from, a job that a lot of people would have. We've probably all been in jobs where we understand, certain bosses, they don't want to hear the bad news. They just want to hear, things that are moving in the right direction, and people adjust how they act based off of, survival in that role. So yeah, whitewashed is probably the way I would put it.
And do you see this as a reason of their failures in the Kursk region in repelling this attack? Maybe because they did not want to inform military commanders about this huge failure in defense there?
Has to be. There's no way, just with the number of drones and the satellite imagery overhead, there's no way Russia didn't see something happening here. There were reports that lower level commanders in Kursk were kind of sending up warnings a week or so prior, and at some point those weren't heeded. So whether it was an individual decision of it's really nothing, or the person didn't want to take that news to Putin, either way, I think now, to be fair, the stopping of Ukrainian forces in Kursk and trying to push them back, that's not a Putin decision. That's going to be entirely within the military command. So I think more of what we saw was in the aftermath of that attack. As Ukraine was moving through Kursk, there were statements put out by Putin kind of suggesting there's not much happening here at all. And you saw a lot of government statements early on saying that Ukraine had been completely pushed out and all of the Ukrainian attackers had been killed and nothing more to worry about. That was like August 7th, the day after it happened. And clearly Ukraine just continued advancing from that point. So I think he's probably getting mixed messages. But again, the military decisions I wouldn't expect in Kursk to be kind of hinging on Putin's decisions there.
Thank you, Preston, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.